Okay, today we're going to be making homemade loaf bread. The things we're going to need are 2 cups of hot water. It's key that this is hot. We're going to need a half a cup of sugar or Splenda or stevia, or you can do a mixture of sugar and Splenda if you like. Then we're going to need 1.5 tablespoons of active dry yeast. And yeast is one of those things that's hard to find now during the pandemic, but we were able to find some restaurant grade bulk yeast online, and it works great. We just put it in a smaller container because it does want to leak out. So we put it in a smaller container. Just be sure you refrigerate after you have opened it. Okay, we're going to need 1/2 teaspoon of salt, 1/4 cup of oil, whatever oil you prefer. We tend to cook most of all with olive oil. It seems to be a little healthier choice. And then you're going to need 6 cups of all-purpose flour. These two have been hard to find during the pandemic, but we have ordered this several times online. It's turned out to be a great product. And if you can find the 2-pound bag, it is exactly how much you need for this recipe. The final thing you're going to need are 2 loaf pans. Ours are different sizes. This is just kind of what we've had on hand for years. And so this recipe is going to make more than just 1 loaf pan. And so we end up just making 1 large, 1 medium, and everybody's happy. So we will begin by putting the sugar. I'm going to move this out of the way. We're going to start with the sugar and the hot water. Just put the sugar in the bowl, and it is key that this water is hot because first of all, we want it to dissolve the sugar, and second of all, it needs to be hot in order to get that, or at least warm, to get that yeast activated. We don't have to go overkill here. We just want to get that dissolved. And just keep in mind also, cooking this bread takes about 2 to 3 hours. It's not going to be something you want to try to do real quick because it's just in steps and processes. Now that we have it blended together, the sugar is dissolved, I'm just going to stir in my yeast. Something to keep in mind here, you do not want to over blend this, and you don't have to get it silky smooth. Just maybe a good little 15, 20 second scrub, and make sure you're getting it off the sides. And it's going to look lumpy. Don't be tempted to over mix. We just want to get it stirred in there well. Okay, so we're just going to let that sit for about 5 minutes. I'm going to set a timer. And when this starts to get creamy and foamy, that's when you know it is ready. But I always just set a timer for 5 minutes, and it's never gone wrong. Okay, now our yeast and hot water and sugar combination have been sitting for 5 minutes. Notice it's starting to get a little creamy. The bubbles, again, it's key to use warm water because that warm water not only helps dissolve the sugar, but the yeast depends on that warm water to activate. Once it has sat for 5 minutes, we're going to mix in our oil and our salt. And I'm just going to give that a little stir there just to kind of mix it all together. No reason to overmix or go overkill on that, just a good little mix. Now I mentioned a moment ago the flour, a 2-pound bag. If you don't have a 2-pound bag, the total amount of flour you're going to need for this recipe is 6 cups, 5 to put in our mix, and then 1 for kneading the dough. So we're going to mix these in one at a time. And that's going to allow the yeast to mix in well with the dough. The first couple of cups that you put in there are going to mix fairly quickly and fairly easily. You don't have to get it down to like a cake batter type mixture at this time. We're just wanting to try to get all of that yeast worked through the dough. We'll go with the second scoop. Again, this is going to just really quick. Those last 2 scoops are going to be the ones that will take the longest to get into the mixture. Okay, our 3rd scoop. Be sure and get that off the sides with your spatula. Want to get all of that mixed in there as good as we can. Okay, our 4th cup. Now you can see it's starting to really thicken up. Starts to get a little tougher to mix. You want to try to use that folding principle, pulling from the bottom and rolling it over. Make sure we're getting all that flour off of the bottom. And now our 5th and final. We got one left for our kneading process. So let's just get this one mixed in. Again, using that folding to get that flour off of the bottom. You can even mash on it a little if you need to. It's not gonna hurt it. We're gonna knead it anyway. All right. I'll try to get it to about that consistency there. It's not perfect. But what's not mixed in, when we put the flour down, we can just blend it in. So I'm just gonna take this final cup of all-purpose flour, kind of spread it around. This measurement has always worked for me, but kind of the principle to this is, if you are out of flour on the table and it's still sticking to your hands, then you need more flour. But that measurement has always worked well for me, so hopefully it will for you. All right, so now we have to knead this. Now when I say sticking, right now it's sticking because I'm still just getting it started. Once we get everything blended, it should no longer stick to your hands. So again, we're going to knead this for 7 minutes. And it is key that you knead this for the full 7 minutes, because the longer you knead dough, the more dense it becomes. And you want your bread, loaf bread at least, to be dense. Whereas a biscuit dough, you wouldn't need it as much because you don't want it to be so dense. You want it to be a little more light and fluffy. Okay, so now I'm starting to get it all blended together. It's starting to not stick, so that's the key. Just keep adding that flour in, and as long as it's not sticking to your hands, there's no need to add more flour to the table. You'll notice too, the longer that you knead the bread, the more dense it becomes, and it becomes a little harder to fold and to knead. But what we're basically doing here is just mixing that yeast through all of the dough. Always makes me think of what Jesus said about a little yeast affecting the whole batch of dough. And that's what we're trying to do, is to get that yeast into all of the dough that we can, so it'll rise good and taste good. Still sticking to my hands just a little. So I'm just going to continue to try to use what I have. I don't want to put too much flour. I just want to use that 1 cup, and if it's still sticking after we're getting close to the end of the 7 minutes, we'll add a little more flour, but I don't think we're going to need it. I like to just dig my fingers through it, roll it, flip it, and it's still sticking to my fingers. So we're going to need to add a little more flour. All right, so for the first time, I've had to add flour. That's okay. Now it's no longer sticking to my hands. Again, don't cheat this 7 minutes. Notice I just needed just a little bit of flour. Didn't take much because it's no longer sticking. And now we've been kneading it for about 3.5 minutes. It's getting a little tacky, but it's not sticking. It's not when I pull my hand out of it the dough coming off on my hand. So we're good. And if it is sticking to your hands, just add your little flour in there. I just don't like to add too much flour. Got about 2 minutes to go. Again, don't cheat the bread. Stick to the 7 minutes. You'll start to feel it in your fingers and your wrist, especially if you've got arthritis like this old guy does. But the bread must be made. Sticking to my hand, a little tacky, but the dough isn't pulling out. Just 1 minute to go. To me, this whole recipe, this is the hardest part. Okay, we are getting to the final countdown. And so I'm going to just start trying to kind of work this into a ball, because as it rises, it's going to need to be in a ball. It's okay if you have some places like that, because we're going to re-knead this bread after it rises. Okay, so my next step is to get the bowl ready. I've already wet a towel to cover with. It's not soaking wet, but it is very damp. And so I'm just going to pour some oil into my bowl. And there's no set amount. I just try to get the sides and the bottoms covered as good as I can. And you're going to drop this in and then flip it. So what I like to do is take the better side and do it first. I kind of make it my top. So I'm gonna make this my bottom. I'm just gonna flip it over now. I'm gonna cover it with this wet towel and let it sit for an hour and rise. Okay, so this one that we just made, it's starting to rise some. You can see it's just starting to pull up, but it's only been 20 minutes. But we're going to take a look, and I'm going to finish up with this one that I started with earlier. Notice how much that is risen. First thing we want to do is punch it down, get the air out of it. Just like that. I'll set this one back out of the way. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to knead this for about 5 minutes. Notice it's oily. We don't need any flour at this point. We'll knead it for 1 minute rather than 5. Sorry about that. Just 1 minute. Knead it 1 minute. You can really smell it too. It smells real doughy, almost like a yeasty almost a brewery type smell. Okay, it's getting really firm. We're just gonna keep kneading it, mixing it. Okay, so at this point, we can go ahead and grease our loaf pans. You can use a spray or you can use your olive oil, either way. I tend to err on the side of a little too much than not enough. Get those rims, because the bread is gonna rise up above those rims. Since this one's a little smaller than this one, I'm going to put a little more in this one. So I'm just rolling it to kind of get me a shape that's gonna kind of simulate the shape of the pan. And I just keep pressuring it, putting some pressure on it, rolling it, getting it out there. And then once I see I'm getting pretty close to the size of my bigger pan, I'll go ahead and just squeeze that and pinch it, and it just comes right off. So I'm gonna put that in that pan, kind of mash it and shape it the best I can. And this one, I'll continue to roll it and shape it to about the same size as this loaf pan, getting close. And it's okay if it doesn't touch the edges when you mash it out. I'll show you here in just a sec. There's a little corner here that the bread's not all the way into. It's okay. As it rises, it will fill in those spaces. Oops. Okay. So now we're gonna let these continue to rise in the loaf pans. Depending on what the humidity, barometric pressure where you live, you know, some recipes say to let this process go on for about 30 minutes. But here in Middle Tennessee, that 30 minutes just doesn't let it rise enough. So what I have started doing is for 30 minutes, I cover it back up, let it rise, and then I will uncover it and let it rise for 30 more minutes. Hang in there, we're close to the home stretch. Okay, so these have been sitting covered with this wet towel. Notice how they're starting to rise up around the rim. We're gonna continue to let that rise. We want it to get about this high, maybe an inch or two above the rim. This one usually doesn't, but I like for my bigger loaf to get on up there. So we're just gonna keep it uncovered now and let it rest and rise for another 30 minutes. Okay, we're at a total of 50 minutes now. We did the 30 minutes covered with a damp towel, and now we're at 20 minutes in. Notice how high it's starting to rise. That's starting to look just right. We've got 10 more minutes to go. So I set a timer when I do this rising without the towel for 20 minutes instead of 30, because I want to allow the oven 10 minutes to heat up while this finishes rising. So we're at 50 minutes total here. I've got the stove preheating at 350 degrees. In 10 minutes, we're going to place these in the bottom rack of the oven. All right, 30 minutes in the oven. Look at those beautiful loaves of bread, I tell you. Okay, so these should be at a temperature of 190 internally. And we'll give her a quick measure just to make sure they're done. This one's at 196, we're done. So we're gonna let those rest for about 10 minutes in the pan, and then we're going to take them out and put them on some cooling racks. More to come. I mean, we are almost finished. It's almost bread eating time. These have cooled for 10 minutes in the loaf pan. These pans are still a bit hot, but you're just gonna flip it out. And it's firm enough you can kind of handle it without it falling apart. You're just gonna set it there on the rack and get this other one out. And just flip it over, and there we go. So now we have our fully cooked loaves, and now is the time to take some butter, softened butter. You can use margarine or Healthy Choice, whatever your option is, but I just kind of dab it on my brush, and we're just going to cover the tops of these with butter, and we're going to continue to let them cool for another 20 minutes or so. And then we will slice it and try to get them stored up. And no need to worry, you can put plenty on here. It won't make it soggy. It'll still be firm on top, just like the loaf bread that you buy at the grocery store. And we'll do this one. Again, we're gonna let these sit for, you can go ahead and slice them now. I have when we were just really hungry for bread. But it seems to do better when you slice them and put your slices in a plastic baggie or something. You want them to be completely cooled. You don't want them to sweat inside the plastic bag. Or whatever you store them in. You could put them in Tupperware or whatever. All right. Just about another 20 minutes and we're going to slice this up, and we can go ahead and store it or eat it or whatever we want to do with it.